dear wife, I failed to get this off as expected. Yesterday the bugle blew forward. The 27th and the 39th started double quick immediately with bayonets fixed. We carried their works handsomely. Everybody agrees in saying they never saw a better charge or know of any better. Through God's mercy I am spared unhurt. Did not get a scratch. I must close. Will write more fully as soon as I can. Your affectionate husband, W. Churchill, 27th Ohio, Union Army.
By the summer of 1864, Union troops under the command of General William T. Sherman had pushed the Confederate Army of the Tennessee and their commander, General Joseph E. Johnston, back again and again until they were literally miles from Atlanta. Starting in North Georgia and working their way south, the Union Army outnumbered the beleaguered Confederate Army at least 2-1. It was all part of a plan that confronted the Confederate Army along a number of fronts. If Atlanta was taken, a major southern network of transportation would be seized, and with that, the collapse of the supply lines.
They are coming down the Western Atlantic Railroad. That's going to be their supply line coming south, the same as it's going to be Johnston's supply line coming north. So it's critical.
Johnston could not allow Sherman to cut his supply line, and its vortex was in Atlanta, thus setting up what would be known as the Atlanta Campaign.
Sherman would confront Johnston's army and then sweep around, usually to his right, the Confederate left, to try to flank Johnston. Johnston, with what Sherman called a lynx-eyed watchfulness, he was clever.
So Johnston's theory is, I'm the smaller guy in a fight. And if I've only got 50 or 60,000 men, let Sherman chase me, and I'll bleed him out. And if you believe in his theory, he'll tell you that from the moment that he left Dalton, or started at Dalton in May, to the time he was relieved of command on the 17th of July, he would tell you that, well, look, proof's in the pudding. I only lost about 10 or 11,000 men, maybe 10,400 men killed or wounded. Whereas I've put 24,000 Federals under Sherman out of action. A friend of mine and mentor, Dr. Richard McMurray, calls this the red clay minuet when speaking of the Atlanta campaign, or what I call the Georgia campaign. And that is because it was sort of like a dance.
The dance that continued between Sherman and Johnston had a cost in lives and in time. Each time territory was taken, the South lost resources and morale. In addition, since 1864 was a presidential election year for the North, losing was not an option for Sherman.
If the Confederates can hold Atlanta and keep Grant in the trenches before Petersburg, the people in the United States, being tired of the war, frustrated, might just elect Lincoln's opponent, the Democratic nominee, George B. McClellan, a United States Army officer who had commanded the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was running on a campaign of ending the war, which some, many, most rendered to mean making a negotiated peace with the Confederacy, recognizing the Confederate independence and stopping the fighting.
In order to show the Northern public a positive result from the ongoing war, Sherman knew Atlanta had to be taken. Capturing the city would deal a major blow to the Confederacy and would essentially shut down Johnston's supply line. In a letter written to his wife in July of 1864, he states,
I regard the death and mangling of a couple thousand men as a small affair, a kind of morning dash, and it may be well that we become so hardened. General William T. Sherman, July 1864.
The campaign had been going well for Sherman. In front of him and his troops was Kennesaw Mountain, and beyond that, his goal, the city of Atlanta. But Kennesaw Mountain, with its fortifications and natural geography, would prove to be impassable for the Union soldiers. Sherman would attempt a frontal assault, and his men would pay for the move. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain would be considered a victory for the rebel army, with about 3,000 Union casualties versus 1,000 of their own.
Kennesaw really, I think, taught Sherman a lesson and his generals a lesson, because you couldn't do a frontal attack at a stronghold like Kennesaw. But once they realized you could flank, then they kept doing those flanking maneuvers all the way from Ruff's Mill Battle all the way till they got to Atlanta, and they realized that was a successful strategy, and it's what pushed the Confederates back. So the Union troops, on the flip side, you can see the Union troops. There's historical accounts that Union soldiers are talking about, I can see the spires of Atlanta in the distance, and that to them, that was the Mecca. Once they reached Atlanta, they knew things were looking good for them, and in the flip side, the Confederates realized this isn't going well at all for us.
Like a giant chess match, Sherman was undeterred from the losses at Kennesaw Mountain and made the next move. Since the frontal assault at Kennesaw failed, Sherman relied on a flank move, forcing Johnston to leave the mountain range and retreat to prepared earthworks in the area between Kennesaw Mountain and the Chattahoochee River, the last major obstacles to taking the city of Atlanta. On July 3, 1864, Sherman's troops were to attack the Confederates at any cost by a small creek and grist mill. It was known as Ruff's Mill.
On the 3rd of July, Lightburn's brigade of the 15th Corps under General Logan ordered that day to make an assault, and they do, and they actually carry the 1st Confederate line of works, which is located just around the curtilage and out from the Ruff's family farmhouse.
We lay behind our works until about noon, when we were ordered to advance and ascertain what was in our front. We marched out about half a mile through the woods, then formed in line of battle, no one dreaming of what we were going to do. The woods extended about 200 yards still to our front. Then lay 2 cornfields extending still farther to the front, fully a quarter of a mile. Then a wooded ravine about 500 yards across, and the far side being considerably the highest, and on top of which the enemy had their works, and from which point they have a fair view of us while crossing the cornfields. In the ravine in our front was quite a stream, on which was a sawmill and a grist mill. The stream, I understand, is called Nickajack Creek. Our lines had been formed but a few moments when we got the command forward march. We had advanced on quick time until we emerged from the woods, before which, however, they dropped a number of shells among us, fortunately doing us no harm. But the moment we left the woods, we received the command, double quick march, and the enemy opened up on us with a battery of 6 guns, just as fast as they could handle them. At the same time, a battery of ours was shelling them vigorously over us. Oh, if you could but witness one such scene, it is grand beyond description. To see a line of men advancing thus right in the jaws of death, as it were, and as it really is to a great many, yet few looking for or expecting it. The enemy shells plowing the earth in front and in the rear of us, then exploding, after which you hear the peculiar singing of the fragments as they fly on their missions of death. Then the screeching of our own shells as they pass but a few feet over our heads, seeking the enemy, which they did most effectually, if we can judge from the looks of their works. Sunday, July 3rd, 1864, Captain Edward B. Moore, 54th Ohio Union Army.
That sets up the 4th of July, and it was the 88th 4th of July, the 88th anniversary of the United States of America. And obviously, Federals were feeling pretty patriotic. In the Federal Army, there were a number of bands playing patriotic music. In fact, it's diarists from both Confederate and Federals alike wrote about it. There were some Confederates that said it was really nice, it was really sweet to hear some of those old songs like Hail Columbia and the Star Spangled Banner that we hadn't heard, you know, and And so, but there was still fighting to be had. Sherman is ordering again McPherson's forces to advance. This time it's the 16th Corps that has played a little bit of hopscotch or leapfrog, but they're now in front. And they cross over Nickajack Creek, much like their comrades in Lightburn's brigade had done the day before. Crossed over from the west to the east bank of Nickajack Creek, right there at the Concord Bridge, right there at the Rough Mill, which forms a horseshoe, by the way. The Nickajack Creek makes a big horseshoe there. And Federals cross there. They push back some Confederate skirmishers. And about 9 in the morning, they deploy, and they take this same ridge. They fire a volley. The Confederates fire a volley. And their artillery is trying to get in action, but they quickly fall back in the weight of the Federal attack in front of them, and fall back to the main Confederate works, which is going to set up some additional fighting that evening. But around the Rough Farm, fighting occurs beginning about 9 a.m. on the 4th of July, and from Fuller's brigade. And that action is going to recommence further east as the Federals push across this territory. So on the Rough's farm, there are remains, and there's evidence. There's evidence from what's been found on the property over the years of just what we described, this running battle where you have Confederate positions on one side of the hill and Federal positions on the reverse side of the east side of the hill. And you have evidence of both artillery and infantry of both Federal and Confederate occupying this ground.
Archaeologists used a variety of technology on the Ruff's Mill battlefield project. Ground-penetrating radar enabled them to see below ground to locate fortification trenches and other battle-related features during field work. A portable X-ray fluorescence device allowed archaeologists to determine the elemental composition of artifacts to help identify their origin.
It all started when research associates at Lamar Institute talked to a local landowner named Philip Ivester. And Philip had showed them some artifacts he found on his property, and Philip was pretty convinced that part of the Battle of Ruff's Mill happened on his property. So the research associates got excited, and they talked to us, and we all decided that it was a good opportunity to apply for a National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program grant. We were fortunate enough to get the grant. It's very competitive, but the cool thing was, I think some of the reasons we got the grant were, one reason is this area of Cobb County is developing so rapidly that the Park Service realized the land is getting carved up to chunks and archaeological sites are being lost at an alarming rate. So that was one of the reasons we got the grant, because the grant is to try to document history before it gets destroyed, and then hopefully also try to conserve it and preserve it if possible.
Archaeologists have a subdiscipline that we've developed since the late 1980s. It's called conflict archaeology or battlefield archaeology. We're sort of latecomers to that. The collectors, the relic hunters, and the metal detector people have already scoured these battlefields for relics, and so we're kind of coming to do a cleanup operation. A lot of these battlefields are really picked over, and there's not much left to find. But we've been very lucky on this particular job. The objects that we did find on the pieces of land that were still preserved tell the story. And in at least 4 locations on the battlefield, we're going to have a great story to tell once we finish. Between the historical records, all the officers' accounts of the battle, the different documents, the maps, the ground-penetrating radar maps that we've made, the metal detector survey, the actual objects that we found, and their location on the battlefield are going to tell the story of the Battle of Ruff's Mill.
Deep?
Not real deep, it may be under this root. It's close to it. Let's see. It might not be great, but we'll see what it is. That might have been it. Oh, still not. Another bullet.
So it's really exciting when we're in the field. We get out of the van, get our equipment out, and start working on a track. We have no idea if there's going to be anything there or not. So on some tracks, we get out and we start walking. It's like, oh my gosh, there's a trench right there. This is exciting. Other tracks, we'll start doing controlled metal detector survey, not find anything, find a lot of modern trash, and then all of a sudden we'll get a mini ball, Civil War bullet. It's like, oh, there's no trench here, but we're finding stuff, maybe there was a camp here, or maybe the trench was here and it's obliterated, but there might be other activities, camps and other things related to the battle that we're finding. So it is quite exciting when we do actually find something in the field, like a trench or artifacts related to the battle.
From the artifacts found on this dig, archaeologists were able to get a much clearer view of the events that happened during the Battle of Ruff's Mill. Different colored dots represent various types of bullets, artillery shells, and other artifacts. The red line represents a Confederate trench, and the blue lines are Union trenches in this area. On this diagram, battle-related artifacts and trenches discovered by archaeology reveal the precise location of the southernmost portion of Ruff's Mill battlefield on the modern landscape. Through this process, archaeologists discovered new information not on previous maps or publications. The image on the left is from a map drawn during and after the Civil War, showing the location of Civil War trenches. The image on the right shows actual trench locations recorded by archaeologists during the Battle of Ruff's Mill project. None of the surviving trenches were drawn on the historic maps from the period, and only discovered through archaeology. This ground-penetrating radar map, made by archaeologists of a portion of the Ruff's farm, shows two buried sections of Civil War trenches. Neither trench is visible on the ground surface. Much of the land around the original Ruff's Mill battlefield has been developed, resulting in the destruction of archaeological sites related to the battle. A tract owned by Philip Ivester is one of the few exceptions.
But anyway, it was about 220 acres back in the 1850s, and there's about 10 acres left now around the home place. So I felt fortunate to live here on 10 acres. But growing up here was a lot of fun. But my parents had a big garden in the backyard, and of course it was one of our Saturday chores to weed the garden, and that's where I found the first mini ball, which is a characteristic cone-shaped bullet with 3 rings around the bottom. I didn't really do much metal detecting over the years. I didn't really until, I don't know, a birthday one year, it's maybe 15 years ago, my wife bought me a metal detector, and I would go out and find nails, but it was fun, it was a fun way to pass the time. Just, if it's a pretty day and you enjoy walking around in the woods, it was a lot of fun. But a couple years later, I found a mini ball, and then another mini ball, and everything you find, it gets a little more interesting and a little more exciting. And then one day I remember I found 9 bullets in one day. It was probably out here in the pasture. I think it was the front yard, but in hindsight, putting it all together and mapping it out, you can see locations of friction primers tell you exactly where a cannon was placed. A friction primer is a little piece of brass tubing that is inserted in the cannon, and it's full of gunpowder or something like that. And when you pull the pin out, these wires spark and it ignites the cannon. And then they discard the friction primer. So a discarded friction primer gives you a pretty good idea of where the cannon was. And by finding several right around this tree, we're on top of a little knoll here near the Ruff House, and it gives you a pretty good idea exactly where the cannons were located here, firing toward Sherman's advancing troops.
As Sherman's troops surrounded the city of Atlanta, new trenches were dug and fortifications put in place by the retreating Confederates. Ironically, enslaved African Americans were forced to perform much of this labor aimed at defeating their would-be liberators. Sadly, many died while in the service of the Confederate Army.
A number of slaves in this theater are impressed or put to work, and essentially their masters, coming from various farms across the middle part of Georgia, are in essence renting them or loaning them to the government and being paid something for them to go dig trenches or build earthworks. So this line, this Smyrna to Ruff's Mill line, was slave labor. Much of the Chattahoochee River line was slave labor, and much of the inner works of around Atlanta were also slave labor. And so certainly African Americans were put into that service. Now contrast that with in North Georgia, there are some freed and runaway slaves from some of the parts of northern Alabama, Tennessee, and North Georgia, and some of those men find themselves running away into Chattanooga or into Nashville volunteering. And so we're going to see African Americans fight in that part of the state.
The Battle of Ruff's Mill began on July 3rd and continued through July 4th of 1864. For the troops on both sides, July 4th was significant. For our nation, it meant independence from the oppression of England. Some Union troops may have felt that military action on this day, more than any other, was helping to free those oppressed by slavery, while many saw it as a way to keep the Union intact. On the stifling hot and humid afternoon of July 4th, after a day of heavy fighting around Ruff's Mill and Farm, the Confederate troops had withdrawn to high ground and were dug in. Both sides had suffered not only from battle, but from marching and exposure to the unforgiving summer temperatures. Union General James B. McPherson received word from the front line that it would be very difficult to advance on the well-placed enemy, and that another approach was ordered.
In other words, mission accomplished is what he's trying to tell Sherman. And Sherman says, au contraire, I want you to take that next hill. I want you to keep pressing. And so McPherson's having to reluctantly tell down the line to the Federals in front, and that includes Fuller's brigade, of which Colonel Noyes and the 39th Ohio are going to draw the lucky assignment, together with the 27th Ohio, of taking that next hill. Colonel Noyes gives a speech, which is quite patriotic, as you can imagine, on the 4th of July, preparatory to an attack that's going to take place about 6 p.m. And so he's there bolstering his men and telling them,
"We have been selected to make this charge because they thought we could do it successfully. And this is the 4th of July, you know, and a bad day to be licked. And we don't want to be. Just fix your bayonets and load your guns and don't fire a shot. Colonel Edward F. Noyes, 39th Ohio, Union Army, before attacking near Ruff's Mill, July 4th, 1864.
Colonel Noyes and the Ohioans took the high ground and pushed the Confederates back even further until the rebels occupied the defenses known as Johnston's River Line at the Chattahoochee River. It was not without a cost.
It is with deep regret that I have to inform you of the death of your son Andrew. He was killed in a charge made by the 27th Ohio on July 4th, 1864, near Nickajack Creek. Words fail me in writing his history. Suffice it to say, he was a brave and fearless soldier. Andrew was buried in a box coffin, which I had made for him and laid alongside the other fallen heroes of his company and regiment. Captain Frank Lynch, Company G, 27th Ohio Infantry, Union Army.
After Sherman captured Ruff's Mill, Johnston fell back again, this time to a new location on the banks of the Chattahoochee River. At this location, a new type of earthwork was being used named for the inventor, Confederate Brigadier General Francis A. Shoup. They were called Shoupades.
Shoupade, in its design, it's like a big arrow point. And then there would be a line, trench line, connecting these arrow points. Now the artillery would not be in the Shoupade, infantry would be in the Shoupade. The artillery would be placed in that line at the bases of the triangle, if you would, to create interlocking fields of fire. You're going to get interlocking fields of fire both from artillery and from infantry fire, so a smaller number can deliver a more effective fire against. But when the Confederates fall back into it, they say, what is this? You expect us to get into that? And so some of them, unfortunately, will begin to alter the design to fit the more conventional style of trench that they had been digging and using all along.
The area between Nickajack Creek and the Chattahoochee River contained both types of defenses. From June 18th to July 3rd, 1864, the Confederacy frantically constructed defenses at this location to defend Atlanta against Sherman's forces. Johnston's chief engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Wilson Prestman, oversaw the construction of the Smyrna Line, running from Smyrna to Nickajack Creek. While he followed traditional methods of trench design and construction, he ensured that this line was a series of very strong, deep trenches. Major Charles Smith of the 27th Ohio Infantry described the scene at Nickajack Creek.
These defenses, called the Smyrna Line, had been prepared by black labor and were the most formidable yet, met with the Union Army.
Union troops storming the Smyrna Line had no concept of what they would encounter next.
Sherman, in describing these works, say that they were the most impressive that he encountered. Definitely in the Atlanta campaign, if not in the entire war itself.
But here we are, July 1864, with uncertainty on the banks of the Chattahoochee River in the face of the Nickajack Creek. And Lincoln, next month, is going to write a desperate document. It weighed heavily north and south. It was clearly the outcome of the war still hung in the balance here.
Well, this war has been dragging on now for 4 years, and people are getting tired. The casualty rates are being pronounced, particularly coming out of Virginia. The casualty rates seem to be horrendous. Lincoln vitally needs a major victory that he can go to the people and say, all right, we can win this thing, stay with me, stick with me, we can do it. And he gets that victory with the capture of Atlanta on the 2nd of September of 1864. This gift, if you would, from Sherman to the president allows him to be reelected. Lincoln's reelection means that a negotiated peace will not take place, secession will not be accepted, and the war will be fought until a successful conclusion and the Union restored. The impact that has in the 20th century is tremendous. A united United States going into World War I, or going, as opposed to 2, maybe even 3 separate nations. The South and the North conceivably could have supported different sides in World War I. You don't know what could have happened that way. But I think being united, the growth that we had as a nation, being able to draw on raw materials and markets from all sections of the country, we had expanded dramatically as a nation, industrially, population-wise, post-Civil War, which would not have happened had the Atlanta campaign not re-elected Lincoln.
On August 31st, Sherman's army captured the railroad line from Macon, severing General Hood's supply line. By September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta had fallen and was occupied by the Union Army. The end was near for the Confederacy, and after General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, it was all but over. The Battle of Ruff's Mill was not one of the largest or most costly battles of the Civil War, but it was significant in the fact that it was part of a number of strategic battles at defensive works meant to protect Atlanta that were won by the Union and resulted in the demise of that city and, in turn, Lincoln's re-election. Today, this battlefield and other surviving battlefields are threatened by urban sprawl. They lay testament to very different aspects of a shared past that we should understand, learn from, and preserve.
So we were able, fortunately here at Kennesaw, to preserve basically 8 miles of both the federal line and the Confederate line, because that's deliberately what they went after when they were acquiring properties to expand from what they already owned down at the site of Cheetah Mill, where the Illinois Monument had been located back in 1914. What we didn't get was the extreme right or left of either of those lines. Subsequent to that, we could have, but in roughly 1945, the government declared that the purchases were essentially complete. And if you look at a map of Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield, you see that there's this great in-holding that's privately owned. Why wasn't that made part of the park? Well, the decision was that it was farmland, and it maintained the rural appearance that it would have had in the law, and therefore we will keep it on the local tax rolls by leaving it in private hands. Well, yes, it was farmland in the 1930s and early 1940s, but it's not any longer. And the acquisition of it now would be useless because it's been built over.
I mean, even prior to this day, when I sat down with Philip and he showed me the things that he had already found in his property, again, it brings to life that experience more, because these are things that we read about in history books, and regardless of where you are geographically, you can read about these things, but when you get a chance to actually see the evidence and know that it came from somewhere close by, it has a little bit more significance and meaning. And so I think for those that live here in Cobb, you know, the events that have happened in our nation's history has a bit more significance knowing that it happened in their backyard. You know, regardless of what side they're on, people can view it through whatever lens of which they choose, but they will not be able to escape the fact that it happened in proximity to where they are today. And perhaps that does mean something, you know, because if you can see where things were so many years ago and where things are today, maybe it even gives you a chance to appreciate how far we've come. Yeah.
Well, what's really amazing is that people respect the past, and people have curiosity about the past. And I guess it's the roots or where we all came from, you know, that where did we come from, or why am I the way I am, or how did I get here? And every single week we have people who walk in or drive in front of the mill and say, can you tell me a little bit about this, or what is the story? And for example, last Sunday we had a young lady who just gave birth to her firstborn daughter, and she said she'd lived in Smyrna her whole life, and she drove by the mill all the time since she was a young girl, and so she wanted to take her picture in front of the mill with her husband and her newborn daughter and their family. That was really touching, and so that really infuses us with a sense of appreciation of what we have, and also a sense of wonder. So that's a wonderful thing to be part of.
It is so poignant to read a diary or a letter or an officer's report from some boy or man who wrote about being on this field, and he saw his comrade die that day. It's not just some name on a concrete marker in a cemetery somewhere or on a courthouse square. but it's a real person. Real lives and families are touched, North and South. It was a horrible war, and the scars are still here today. We walked on that field and saw undulations, which no doubt were remains of some of the Federal works, artillery and infantry, and then converse that on the other side, the Confederate works, facing to the west. We also walked in a cemetery where there were undulations where no doubt some of the temporary graves of some of the Federals that had fallen were buried there, and then after the war were reinterred to the Marietta National Cemetery. It's very humbling to imagine the sorrow and the loss of life, North and South, through this campaign and through this war.